Welcome to the second in a new series, Wise Words, a deep dive into contemplative science, hosted by the Contemplative Studies Centre at the University of Melbourne. I'm Nicholas Van Dam, the director of the centre. I'd like to begin by respectfully acknowledging the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, who are the traditional owners of the land in which many of us may be residing today. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and to any Indigenous or First Nations people who may be joining us today. Today, we're joined by Dr. Anna Halafoff, Associate Professor in Sociology of Religion in the School of Humanities and Social Sciences at Deakin University. Anna is a member of the Alfred Deakin Institute and Chief Investigator on 2 Australian Research Council projects on the worldviews of Generation Z Australians and on religious diversity in Australia. Her other research interests include interreligious relations, religion and education, preventing violent extremism, contemporary spirituality, and Buddhism in Australia. In today's presentation, Anna will draw on earlier scholarship on spirituality in Australia and recent studies on the worldviews of Generation Z and on conspirituality in Australia to examine the complex history and contemporary dynamics of spirituality in this country. If you have questions, please post them in the Q&A at any stage of the presentation, and Anna will address as many of them as we possibly can towards the end of the session. Thank you and welcome, Anna.
Thank you, Nicholas. I'm just going to share my screen. All right. So I would also like to begin by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation as the traditional custodians of the unceded lands which I am on today, and to pay my respects to their elders past, present, and future, as well as to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people listening today. So Australia has always been a culturally, spiritually, and religiously diverse country, beginning with its First Nations people and with large waves of immigration since the 1850s. This diversity has intensified since the 1970s, enabled by global travel, trade, and communication flows. Growing numbers of Australians are identifying as spiritual, but not religious, and also as spiritual and religious. There has also been a significant uptake of spiritual practices, including contemplative practices such as meditation, yoga, and conscious dance over the past decade, and a rise of conspirituality, the nexus between spirituality and conspiracy theories in the wellness industry during the COVID-19 pandemic. Despite spirituality's long and strong presence in Australia, it is typically not taken as seriously as religion or non-religion, at least in official political and academic spheres. And similar patterns can be observed in international contexts. So during these past 2 decades, a small but growing subfield of scholars have been studying the enduring and mainstreaming of interest in spirituality and its relationship with religion. This has been accelerated by social media, but also due to a rise of interest in alternative frameworks for human and planetary well-being in response to the COVID-19 pandemic and climate change. Anna Fidel and Kim Nib and their colleagues are currently calling for contemporary studies of religion to move beyond a binary focus on religion and the secular toward a triangular focus on religion, the secular and non-religion, and spirituality, and to take spirituality more seriously. They argue that a reluctance to do so in scholarly and political spheres stems in large part from the pervasive and increasingly discredited view that spirituality is largely private and individual, and that it is predominantly practiced by women. This presentation examines recent research on spirituality in Australia to further investigate these assertions. My colleagues and my recent study of Australian Generation Z teens revealed that 38% of them identified as spiritual. This was a surprising finding, given that spirituality had previously largely been associated with Generation X and the turn of the 21st century New Age in Australia, and had not received significant scholarly attention in sociology of religion here since the mid-2000s. My presentation begins with a brief overview of international literature and theories pertaining to spirituality relevant to the Australian context. It then revisits insights on spirituality in Australia from earlier publications and by scholars David Tacey and Gary Baumer, and also First Nations scholars Vicky Greaves and Tyson Yankaporta. Before examining the findings of two contemporary Australian studies I've conducted with colleagues on the worldviews of Generation Z and on conspirituality, science, and COVID-19 in Australia. And I focus here primarily on presenting the data related to contemplative practices in these studies, and we'll conclude by discussing how our findings on spirituality in Australia concur with and also extend Fidel and Nib's arguments in several significant ways. So building on Paul Heelas's earlier work on the New Age movement and self-spirituality, Heelas and Woodhead famously argued in The Spiritual Revolution that a spiritual lexicon focused on holistic practices of yoga, the New Age, and mind-body-spirit connection was becoming more common in popular culture than traditional Christian vocabulary at the turn of the 21st century. This may have been an exaggeration, but there is no doubt that a significant shift was occurring at that time, with declining Christian affiliation and rising interest in spirituality, where Christianity had, quote, a new competitor in the spiritual marketplace, unquote. Heelas and Woodhead's research tested the spiritual revolution claim, which argued that religion, and namely Christianity, and Charles Taylor's observation of a massive subjective turn of modern culture, Heelas and Woodhead described this reorientation as moving away from deferring to higher authority and instead having the courage to become your own authority. They equated religion with outmoded, authoritarian, externally transcendent, and duty-focused ways of being and relating, reliant on dogmas and scriptures, and spirituality, by contrast, as a more this-worldly, interior, and authentic experience of the sacred, equated with self-realization and subjective well-being culture. They argued that religion was bound to decline and spirituality to flourish in late modern societies. Dick Hultman and Steph Orkers labeled this trend the spiritual turn, but they also argued that many younger people were turning away from religion and not necessarily embracing spirituality, and correctly predicted that both the non-religious and the spiritual but not religious, the SBNRs, would increase. They also called for research into the social construction of self-spirituality and for further interrogation of the claim that it is purely individualistic, given the lack of empirical research on these aspects of spirituality at that time. Nancy Ammerman's research on everyday spirituality and the overlaps between religion and spirituality did just that. Ammerman noted that psychologist Kenneth Pargament had also problematized the polarization of religion and spirituality, with religion typically being viewed as the institutional bad guy and spirituality as the individual good guy, arguing this was not actually backed up by empirical evidence. Ammerman's and earlier studies, including by Pargament, stress the similarities between religion and spirituality and the fact that many people are both religious and spiritual and not always simply SBNR. Ammerman's study also revealed a strong commitment across the cohorts of her participants to what she called ethical spirituality, where participants were committed to living a virtuous life, transcending self-centered interests and helping others. She noted a theistic spirituality among religious and neo-pagan adherents with strong beliefs in various deities, and an extra-theistic spirituality among the non-affiliated and neo-pagans that, while located in the core of the self, was also deeply relational, connected to community, in awe of the natural world, with works of art and beauty. Ammerman outlined 11 key meanings of spirituality, including belief in God and or a divine presence, practices, connection with others and nature, and sacredness of focus on the self. Moreover, Ammerman also observed shared spiritual lexicons and aesthetics among what she problematically called spiritual tribes that strengthen common bonds. She also argued that there was a need to take spiritualities, plural, more seriously in contemporary studies of religion. So these studies problematize assertions that spirituality is purely individualized or that religion is simply giving way to spirituality. Contemporary sociological studies of religion are stressing the lived and embodied, what Inga Furseth has called religious complexity, and or what Baumer et al. Call worldview complexity of societies, with spirituality being part of this landscape alongside religion and non-religion. Contemporary spirituality is certainly booming, as are some forms of religion, and while others are declining. And this complexity is perhaps best explained by examining diverse worldviews' relationship to neoliberalism, the world's most prevalent ideology. Francois Gautier claims that the most successful leaders and influencers in contemporary societies are those who are increasingly adopting neoliberal values, discourses, and practices, as well as branding and marketing strategies. Those who emphasize the experiential, authenticity, expressive individualism, self-discovery, freedom of choice, immanent transcendence, visibility, belonging, community, and healing, who possess charismatic authority, are transnational, and who harness mobility and digital technology, are displaying vitality and attracting significant followers. This, according to Gautier, explains the global popularity of diverse religious and spiritual movements and practices, including Pentecostalism, pilgrimages, neo-paganism, and the spiritual well-being industry. At the same time, Gautier observes that while the world of consumerism is a thoroughly enchanted place, and that consuming is the new opium of the people, those who are disenchanted by or excluded from it may turn to radical forms of religion and or spirituality or other ideologies in contestation and out of despair. This helps to explain the rise of nationalist and extremist movements and charismatic leaders, harking to go back to old authoritarian ways, to make their nations pure and great again. Gautier's insightful point is that whether these movements are aligned with and or contest neoliberalism, are peace-building and or violent, they are still primarily responding to and being shaped by the global neoliberal market. Earlier scholarly critiques, such as Corrett and King's Selling Spirituality and Andrea Jane's Selling Yoga, also presented contemporary spirituality as intimately tied to capitalism and neoliberalism in ambivalent ways. While spiritual communities are commonly thought to be socially progressive, peaceful, and apolitical, Jane argues that they can display conservative, moralizing, and nationalistic agendas, as currently evidenced by the conservative, Islamophobic, and homophobic nationalistic Hindutva movement's promotion of yoga, Ayurvedic medicine, and spiritual tourism. The perception of spirituality as benign has also been eroded in recent years, with rising concerns regarding issues of racial, gender, and sexuality inequality and sexual abuse in spiritual communities, as well as issues of cultural appropriation and the use of spiritual and pagan symbols in far-right and nationalist doctrines of racial purity. Moreover, the intensification of conspirituality, the nexus between spiritual beliefs and conspiracy theories during the COVID-19 crisis, and the rise of misinformation, vaccine refusal, and radicalization in spiritual communities is further challenging spirituality's peace, love, and mung bean stereotype. So in response to calls by scholars to pay closer attention to spirituality's contextual differences, this presentation now turns to a case study of spirituality in Australia to test the claims and hypotheses of international scholars regarding the significance of spirituality in contemporary Australian society, its individual, personal, social, political dimensions, and its relationship to neoliberalism. So while there has been substantive research conducted and published in Australia on rising religious diversity and the non-religious over the past 2 decades, and an accompanying acknowledgement that Australia is a secular and multi-religious society in official spheres, such as in the Australian curriculum, spirituality is typically marginalised and or trivialised in academic and political domains despite its popularity. Spirituality, like religion, is a contested term. When referring here to spirituality and spiritual well-being, I draw on First Nations scholar Vicky Greaves and Tacey, who describe it as a sense of relational interconnectedness with and belonging to a greater whole that includes persons and the entire natural world. Fidel and Nib differentiate holistic spirituality, equated with alternative New Age spirituality, the wellness industry, and SBNRs, from a broader contemporary spirituality, which also encompasses many religious forms. Given the long history of Indigenous spirituality in Australia, I have expanded Fidel and Nib's typology to include and foreground First Nations spirituality. I've also renamed contemporary spirituality religious spirituality, given many religious traditions, particularly from the Asia-Pacific region, have been present in Australia since the mid to late 19th century. Fidel and Nib's argument that the underlying reason for spirituality's relative marginalisation is that it has largely been associated with women and the individual private sphere echoes earlier claims by Australian scholar David Tacey that the official Australian national character is governed by a rationalistic, masculine and practical ethos, resulting in the denial of the sacred in Australia's stubbornly secular socio-political domains, despite its prevalence within the more creative and emotive so-called feminine realms of the arts, health and healing. He argued that we are a culture split between thought and feeling with a, quote, hidden spirituality. Baumer agreed that Australians have a much less explicit public spirituality located on the margins and not the centre. He used Australian historian Manning Clark's phrase, a shy hope in the heart, to describe Australian expressions of spirituality and religion that are less overt than other societies. Tacey further explained that Australian spirituality is more down to earth, connected to country and First Nations, and embodied spirituality of deep seeing and deep listening of Didiri, quoting Miriam Rose Ungamer. According to Greaves, spirituality in Australia includes First Nations knowledges that have informed ways of being and thus well-being since before the time of colonisation, ways that have been subsequently demeaned and devalued. She stresses that spirituality is also deeply appreciated by non-Aboriginal people who understand and value the different ontologies, understandings of what it means to be, epistemologies as ways of knowing, and axiologies, the basis of values and ethics, that Aboriginal philosophy embodies as potential value to all peoples. More recently, Tyson Yunkaporta, in his book Sand Talk, has explored and shared First Nations knowledge systems in Australia with the wider public, and particularly their potential to contribute to planetary well-being and world repairing in the face of ecological crises. This spirituality, until recently, has been largely beneath official religious notice, given it does not fit within European colonial notions of the sacred, equated largely with Judeo-Christian faiths in lofty heights, which divide the sacred from the profane and continue to dominate over and eclipse other forms of spirituality and religion in Australia. In addition, my colleagues and I, in our study of Buddhism across the far north, have observed that spirituality's association with Asian cultures and religions also contributes to spirituality's marginalisation in this country, as although they have a long history here, they are relatively invisible, quote, compared to the Abrahamic faiths of Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, as has previously been noted also in the US by Natia and Sue. Even Tacey and Baumer did not sufficiently acknowledge Asian culture's presence or contribution to spirituality in Australia beyond more recent New Age influences. So building upon Ghassan Haj's insights, we also argue that Australia remains largely stuck in the myth of a white Christian nation, rather than recognising its triangulated spiritual, religious and non-religious, as well as its First Nations, Asian and European worldview complexity and reality. Moreover, Tacey argued that the Australian national ideal expressed in our national anthem, to be young and free, denies the presence of First Nations peoples, the age of the continent and virtues of wisdom and responsibility. He adds that fantasies of newness, of terra nullius, of empty land are a blatant lie, and that, quote, secular Australia too was founded on a series of white lies, unquote. Tasey notes that the presence and power of the sacred in Australia, most evident in the ancient land and its vast sense of space, is undeniable, and that the spiritual permeates many aspects of Australian social and political life, particularly Aboriginal land rights and reconciliation, environmental issues, health and education. This also aligns with Fidel and Nib's argument that despite attempts to disempower spirituality by relegating it to the private sphere, embodied, effective spiritual practices are empowering and subversive as they challenge dominant patriarchal, rational, modernist paradigms, epistemologies, and power structures. These arguments regarding the significance and complexity of spirituality in Australia are further strengthened by empirical evidence gathered into recent Australian studies. So this is our Australia's Generation Z study and our book that came out last year. And if you just take a moment to read yourselves, the project team, and the methodology. So recent Australian census data and our AGZ study show that a decreasing proportion of the Australian population identifies as Christian and a growing proportion identifies as non-religious and with other religions. Australians do not have the option to select spiritual on the census, but other recent Australian studies, including ours, have given participants the opportunity to identify as SBNR or spiritual and religious. So in our robust nationally representative survey of 1,200 young Australians aged 13 to 18, we found that 22% reported being spiritual but not religious, and 16% religious and spiritual. In terms of gender, female teens were twice as likely to be SBNR or religious and spiritual than males. Our study also revealed a significantly high uptake of spiritual, including contemplative practices among Australian Gen Z teens. 28% had seriously practiced meditation and 22% had practiced yoga outside of school. And also of spiritual beliefs, including 20% in astrology, 29% in reincarnation, and 50% in karma. Our study also included interviews with 30 of the survey participants. Meditation in particular was something many AGZ interviewees had tried at least once, and several participants practiced more regularly. Meditation was seen as fashionable and beneficial and was practiced individually, but also socially with family and friends. Young people were also introduced to it through school, friends, or family. This included one participant who exclaimed, "All the cool kids do it these days. Everyone talks about meditation," saying it's really good. High percentages of Australian teens also reported experiencing an awareness of a higher presence or power or a connection to nature. When asked about what places were sacred to her, SBNR Freya described how she likes sitting at the top of a giant pine tree. She explained how there's just one tree that looks like this giant bird's nest at the top. Like, I just sit in it and look over the ocean and it's just pristine. She also added how she's really about getting out into nature and nurturing myself. At the same time, her connection to nature also inspired her environmental activism, including participating in anti-logging protests. So similarly to the findings of international studies cited earlier, the AGZ study revealed that many Australian teens view spirituality as a connection to nature or a higher power, which may or may not be experienced as God. They also hold several spiritual beliefs, such as karma and reincarnation, and engage in many eclectic practices, including meditation, yoga, tarot, prayer, and creativity, with an emphasis on embodied self-care and personal growth. They sometimes did so on their own, but also often more socially with friends and family. So while spirituality can no doubt sometimes be fun, it is also something that many of the Australian teens take seriously, and it can also inform their ethical conduct in the world and the need to care for others, including animals and the environment. Again, if you just want to take a moment to read the project team and the funding source of this project. So our Conspirituality Science and the COVID-19 in Australia study project focused on the spread of disinformation among spiritual and wellbeing influencers during the height of the pandemic in 2020 and 2021. Our project team chose to bracket the con to problematize the term conspirituality and to encompass a wider spectrum of spiritual beliefs and practices, including those that are non-controversial or those that draw on conspiracy theories, selling conspirituality in a marketized and hyper-mediatized world. So we found that many Australians engage in spiritual practices and many turn to them as supports during the coronavirus crisis. Alongside this study, we conducted a parallel survey of spirituality in Australia. And this pilot survey was with 250 self-identified spiritual Australians. And it was conducted in 2021. And it revealed that most were either spiritual and religious or SBNR. The religious and spiritual were mainly Christian, but also, as you can see, from other religious traditions. Spiritual Australians participated in a vast array of spiritual and contemplative practices, mostly meditation and yoga, and also significant numbers of them had consulted alternative health practitioners. Spiritual retreats were also popular, as were breath workshops. High numbers also believed in life after death, angels, karma, ghosts, communicating with the dead and reincarnation, and had experienced a strong connection with nature, the universe, or a higher power, similarly to Gen C. The vast majority of our participants approved of COVID-19 restrictions and had either already been vaccinated or were intended to be vaccinated. Now, of course, this is a small sample sort of pilot survey, 250 participants. And of course, you can argue that people who were anti-vaccination and anti-lockdowns are also perhaps less likely to take a voluntary survey. So, you know, they're indicative at best, but still interesting in terms of that broader snapshot of people who are identifying as SBNR or spiritual and religious, many of them Christian. So at the same time, many spiritual adherents, including First Nations peoples, understandably have high degrees of mistrust towards state scientific and patriarchal history. Spiritual epistemologies inform alternate ways of living from that of the mainstream and have a long history of opposing dominant culture. This in itself is not problematic, as many argue for the need to draw on First Nations and Asian frameworks of interdependence to counter anthropocentrism and for world repairing. Yet our conspirituality study did reveal that for a minority of conspiritual Australians, the clash between those ushering in the New Age and those wielding the so-called New World Order resulted in a cosmic war, with spiritual warriors defending and strengthening their spiritual tribes in opposition to mainstream culture. They did so emboldened by narratives of exceptionalism and exclusivity, of secret and suppressed ways of knowing, drawing on ancient utopic wisdom oriented to both the past and the future. They also exhibited privilege in their spiritual bypassing of the reality and suffering of the pandemic. Conspiritualists prioritize authenticity and autonomy, experiences, gut feelings, and intuition over rational scientific facts. This all fuels their vaccine hesitancy and/or refusal, where vaccines are seen as toxins, poisoning their pristine bodies. They spend considerable time influencing by evangelizing others, particularly on social media, to see things the conspiritualists' one and only right way, selling conspirituality to raise their statuses and for financial gain. This study also documented a trend of sciencey spirituality in Australia, where conspiritualists both co-opt and critique science and technology to strengthen and spread their claims how and when it suits them. So, for example, Australian conspiritualist and Aussie warrior, or dubbed Aussie warrior, alternative health practitioner Neil Pascoe, also known as Nate Max, stated at the height of the pandemic that, quote, Bill Gates vaccine, science, any of these websites like Facebook, Instagram, social media, they're getting absolutely decimated by smart people who are understanding the narrative. But later in the same YouTube video, he called for, quote, a global meditation as he had his, quote, chi master sorted. And because there's something that works, that's something that works. It's scientifically proven that we can co-create a new reality and win this, what we are calling spiritual war. The conspirituality study also found that essentialized gender norms and hypermasculine narratives calling men to this spiritual war are also challenging previous norms of female-dominated and non-violent spirituality. Another key finding of the conspirituality study is that while there are some disturbing overlaps between them, the aesthetics and lexicon of conspiritual movements are distinct from far-right groups involved in spreading misinformation, protesting against restrictions and vaccine mandates and threatening state authorities. And this was discovered by colleagues of ours in Spain, Margarita, who have an article in our special issue on conspirituality. It is therefore important not to conflate all members of spiritual and well-being communities with militant wellness. While there are spiritual adherents who may be vaccine hesitant and resistant, they seem generally less militant than far-right movements. More research, however, is required to develop a better understanding of these movements and processes of radicalization occurring within them. So now to conclude, this data reveals a spiritual complexity as observed in the Australian context, similarly to what has been observed in contemporary studies of spirituality internationally. Being spiritual in Australia is made up of diverse practices and beliefs, where the presence of a higher power, which may or may not be experienced as God, is felt in sacred places and often equated with nature and the body. Spirituality also focuses on slowing down and recentering, and on an ethics of care for self and others. Spirituality is permeating all parts of private and public life. It is hybrid, composed of many eclectic and often contradictory elements. While it can be self-focused, it is also deeply relational, and it can also be violent and/or peace-building, both creating and countering direct and structural violence of settler colonial patriarchal societies and neoliberalism. So conspiritualists, for example, do this as part of an act of, spiritual violence and peace building is done, it can be done as both or either an act of resistance against the pressures of neoliberal society, but also these practices can be part of a burgeoning and highly profitable well-being industry, both of which explains their popularity. So my colleagues and my findings on Australia thereby concur with Fidel and Nib's arguments and also extend them in several ways. They reveal the pervading and enduring significance of spirituality in Australian society, which has been previously undervalued. Australia has remained largely stuck in outdated world religions and religious secular binary paradigms and the myth of a white Christian modern nation, which excludes First Nations and Asian spirituality. Consequently, the importance of rest, stillness, silence, and listening have been underappreciated in studies of religion. which focus more on people's actions and beliefs rather than on their non-action and non-conceptual awareness. I also agree with Tacey that the Australian ideal of being young and free has led to a stifling of wisdom in the upper echelons of this society. There are some indications that this is finally changing, with a rising post-colonial and environmental consciousness, to use Tacey's term there, addressing abuses of power, including conceptual violence. These findings thereby strengthen the case to take spirituality more seriously as part of a triangulated spiritual, religious, and non-religious worldview reality that has long existed in Australia. In addition, my colleagues and I have expanded Fidel and Nib's helpful framework of holistic spirituality and broader contemporary spirituality to one of First Nations religious and holistic spirituality. And while this arises from the Australian context, it could also perhaps be applied elsewhere. We also contend that spirituality's association with First Nations and Asian traditions has also marginalised it from official domains, and that there is a strong need to further decolonise studies of religion in Australia and internationally to address these exclusions. We also assert that significant risks associated with wellbeing influences and spiritual movements, which intensified during the COVID-19 pandemic, regarding issues of misinformation, nationalism, and violence, are challenging spirituality's peaceful stereotype. And finally, that this, alongside a growing nexus between spirituality and science, is impacting gender dynamics and drawing more men into spiritual movements. So I conclude that spirituality is certainly not just a passé 1990s New Age phenomena, or simply replacing religion in the 21st century, or that its abiding presence should no longer be ignored, and that its abiding presence should no longer be ignored or downplayed. My colleagues and I also argue for the need for more in-depth research on spirituality's association with personal and planetary wellness, as well as risks to society in and beyond Australia. Thank you.
Thank you for that fascinating presentation. As the questions start to come in, and I can see we've got a few, please do post those in the Q&A if you can. I'll try to monitor the chat as well, but if you could put them in the Q&A. I might just take the opportunity to ask you a question myself. So you talked at the beginning in particular about particularly kind of the New Age movement and kind of how spirituality sort of there's this connection with the neoliberal sort of modality, right, or style of thinking. And I guess, and you talked a bit about sort of commodification and sort of how there's been some concerns raised in particular about commodification of sacred practices and traditions. So I guess I'm curious what your thoughts are about, or if you if you have any thoughts about sort of what other scholars might say about how, in particular, Indigenous or other spiritual communities might navigate some of that tension. So I've seen a number of efforts to kind of involve elders or representatives from traditional communities kind of be on particular platforms or to come and give guided sessions or things like that in these very commodified ways. And so I guess I'm wondering, what are your thoughts, or what are the recommendations that I guess of scholars in this area about how those individuals might navigate that tension of wanting to be seen and wanting to be heard, but also kind of not being commodified?
Thank you, Nicholas. It's a really important question. And it's something that, I myself would like to actually do more research on in the Australian context. Internationally, there are certainly scholars, and particularly scholars of colour, that are working on this, and also researching researching specifically. So Andrea Jane's book is fantastic. She's got a more recent book now, piece, as well as her earlier work on selling yoga, because of issues pertaining to cultural appropriation of yoga, Jane background herself. So in Australia, in terms of First Nations, I think, again, that question is perhaps best posed to someone who is a First Nations person and scholar themselves, but I will try to answer the question as best I can. I think the general consensus is that it is really problematic when people take practices or take even, written work or spoken work by others without significant respect and acknowledgement of the sources of where these ideas and these practices come from. And so there is a sense that on one hand, you could stop using, of course, you should stop using them, but you should stop practicing or referring to them at all. But on the other hand, there seems to be an argument that if practitioners and scholars can partner with First Nations people or people from Asian religious traditions and actually genuinely, deeply engage with them and learn from them and acknowledge them and partner with them, then that is obviously a better way to proceed. And there are people who are First Nation scholars and practitioners of spiritual practices and thoughts who are obviously willing to share their knowledge and their wisdom. And so we should, of course, try to seek them out and read their work and include their work, cite their work, engage with them, partner with them, because obviously we have a lot to learn.
Thank you for that. I guess there's a question here that sort of actually, I think, maybe follows on a bit about how to do that. So the question is, how can governments include non-mainstream spiritual groups or individuals in the mix so that they can get the mix right rather than just look at religion as mainstream major groups? So I guess, what can we do to sort of, I mean, even if it's not government, what can government do? I guess, what can we do to encourage government to sort of represent these various groups that you've talked about, the spiritual but not religious, or the spiritual and religious, or the other groups that sort of aren't in the traditional categories?
It's such an important question. And my earlier work actually was on the interfaith movement, right? The interreligious movement. So this question is also relevant in terms of state bodies that are trying to consult on issues pertaining to diverse worldviews, but also these interreligious bodies that have and still do up to now exclude spiritual groups. We are still very much stuck, as I said in my presentation, in this world religions model. And then we tend to, in more recent years, we have become more respectful and more acknowledging of the need to work. When I say we, I mean like interfaith groups and even committees that are sometimes brought together to meet with the government on issues. For example, I work on education, so I'm often in these kinds of groups with diverse people from different religious traditions and also from academia. And what I was saying is that more recently we've included people like rationalists, humanists, secularists. So there has been this sort of shift away from seeing Australia, and it's been articulated in this way in the Australian curriculum as multi-faith and secular as a nation. But the spiritual is still, excluded for a lot of the reasons that I've just talked about this last hour. So what can we do about it? I think the research hopefully is helpful, because if you have that kind of data, I mean, the Gen Z study, that's a nationally representative study. That's a robust data set. So if you have the data that shows that, well, actually you're missing a significant amount of the population, and particularly with young people, it's still relevant. I think there was very much this stereotype that spirituality is a sort of new age passe thing. It's not really anything we should take too seriously, but clearly the evidence suggests from these different studies that it is serious. So I think we need to do more research. We need to talk about it more, and hopefully if we can shift, as Fidel and Nib have pointed in studies of religion too, to that more triangular model, maybe that can also shift some of that, the power relations. May I add that with First Nation spirituality, I think those shifts have already occurred or are occurring. And again, looking at the brand new curriculum that's come out, just been, announced fairly recently this year, you can see there's far more foregrounding of First Nations peoples, but also First Nations spirituality across the curriculum. Having said that, in the main bit of text that explains our multi-faith secular sort of makeup, they're listed, but Christian tradition is still foregrounded, which we certainly made submissions to say that was problematic, but we weren't heard on that. So yeah, there's still, I say we've made positive changes, but I think there's still a lot.
So another question about just, I guess, where the term or the phrase conspirituality kind of came from. So Lamhyun Sunim asked or mentioned that this is a new term to her, and that she was just curious sort of where it came from and kind of how it came to be.
Well, I'd love to claim it and say I invented it, but I did not. It's got an interesting history. So Charlotte Ward, who I believe was a practitioner, and David Voas, who was actually a very famous scholar, sociologist of religion from the UK, first wrote a paper on conspirituality in 2011. And they were looking at kind of millennial sort of, turn of the 21st century conspiracies. And David Icke was mentioned as a key sort of conspiracist back in that paper, from even the work he was doing, in the 90s and stuff. So they wrote this paper very much aligning conspirituality with New Age, as if it was something new. And then there was another very famous paper. Sorry, I'm getting a bit too detailed and nerdy here, but there was a very famous paper that followed that one that importantly critiqued their notion that conspirituality was something new, and said, no, actually conspirituality, this nexus between spiritual beliefs and conspiracy theories, has a very, very long history. So our study also has a historical dimension. So there is a paper, there's a special issue that will soon be coming out in the Journal for the Academic Study of Religion. And there is two historical papers in that study, as well as I think 3 that are more contemporary, looking at this very interesting kind of nexus. So Ward and Voas focus mainly on the sort of 2 main conspiritual convictions, that there was this opposition between the New Age and the New World Order, and the clash sort of between them.
So there's an interesting comment. So Sarah says, as a SBNR, I find other SBNR people in my community quite judgmental towards Christians, but respectful of other religions, especially more trendy religions like Buddhism. I'm discovering that people in my circles exploring faith, God, or religion are doing so, quote, in the closet, perhaps due to societal judgment. Yet one generation earlier, people like my mum can say they are going to church, express their religious faith, and not be judged by their peers. Interesting change. Curious as to your thoughts or reflections.
Great question, and definitely a trend that is observable in society. So as a sociologist, we're always looking for these patterns and trends, so that's really significant. Yes, and so there is a great study actually on young Buddhists done by a colleague of mine, Kim Lam, and in her research, she actually found that a lot of Australians, young Australians, were sort of quite negative about religion generally, and so we can see that with the rise of the non-religious. However, in our survey, the Gen Z study, and I didn't get to show that slide because my time was limited, but we came up, well, Andrew Singleton is our quantitative guru, not me, but we came up with he came up with a latent class analysis that ended up with 6 worldview types. Now, this is relevant to the question in that that people sort of see that huge amount. I think in one of my slides, I think it's like 52% or something are non-religious. But then they don't understand the complexity within that the religious nuns, many of whom are spiritual, which we found as well, right? But the other important thing that we found is that there were also a group of young people who were indifferent, like genuinely indifferent. And I think that's another common false description of younger generations, that they don't really care about religion at all. It really means nothing to them. So I think there's only about 15% who are genuinely indifferent, and only around 23. I've probably got those figures a bit wrong, but anyway, it's in that ballpark who are strongly non-religious, right? So it's the strongly non-religious that are the ones that are likely to have anti-religious views, not the whole 50% who are non-religious, right? So again, the Gen Z study has a whole section on attitudes to religious diversity and attitudes to minority faiths. Interestingly enough, people had a pretty positive view of Christianity in our study. So of all the religions, when they were asked, the Christianity came up actually as the most positive, which was also a bit surprising, because the common perception is that Christianity is kind of under attack. Why are people having negative views or shame about identifying as Christian if they're young Australians? Well, I think a lot of it is to do with public perception of religion. And I'd say it's two things. One, the Royal Commission, I think, has into institutional child sexual abuse, I think has had a huge impact. And again, that's not just happened in Australia, that's happened, you know, awareness of these types of issues of abuse within spiritual communities that I only just touched on in my paper. You know, I think it's really made people much more conscious about the negative and the violence and the abuse that can happen within religion. And a lot more people have been speaking up about this. And that's also issues pertaining to sexuality diversity and religion are huge internationally, nationally, but especially among young people. So our study focused on religious diversity, but also sexuality diversity. And we wrote a paper together with some Canadian colleagues who did a similar study. And they found, and we found, that in some of our interviewees, that some of the reasons why people were distancing themselves from religion and from Christianity was certainly to do with issues of homophobia or transphobia, or, you know, issues where the church groups were not sufficiently respectful of sexuality diversity and rights. And then I think the final thing here is, I think after 9/11, like, you know, people sort of predicted religion would disappear altogether as well, right? Like that. And so 9/11, around that time, it sort of really put religion much more front and center again into the public sphere. And the focus was a lot on the Abrahamic faiths, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. And what happened is it sort of turned into quite a closening of religion-state relations that I think a lot of people then became very uncomfortable about. So then you sort of have this very strong anti-religious, the hard secular swing. Obviously that plays into it as well. So very sort of prominent public critiques of religion by Dawkins and co, and new atheism, all of that. Yeah, so that's a very long answer to your question, but it is always complicated. So Inga Firth's theory of religious complexity, we're just quoting at the end of every lecture, at the end of every presentation. But yeah, it sums it up.
So I'm going to try and ask two questions at the same time. So one is just a question around clarifying what you mean by religious spirituality. And then another question is actually sort of asking the opposite, which I guess is sort of to say, one of the participants says that they're confused or unclear, I guess, what it would mean to be religious but not spiritual, and just wondered if you could elaborate on what exactly that means or what that looks like.
Yeah, I think they're good questions again, like the difference between the SBNRs and the religious and spiritual. So basically, okay, when people get asked the question on the census, they're only allowed to choose one religion or to say that they're non-religious, in terms of the boxes they can tick, right? So for the Gen Z study, so that we were able to make a comparison, we had to ask that first question the same way. And that gives people the chance to basically tell you whether they're religious or not, right? So in our study, if you've chosen that you're religious there, you're allowed to then answer a second question that says, are you more than one religion? Because that's a new thing too that I didn't really touch on in my presentation, but so you could actually be more than one religion. Now, the other thing is the census question, as I did speak in my presentation, doesn't ask you anything about spirituality, right? So then in the AGZ study, we gave people those 4 options. They could be either religious, just and not spiritual. They could be spiritual, but not religious. They could be religious and spiritual, or they could be sort of like choose not to answer that question or something else, or, whatever they wanted to be or not wanted to be. So basically, if you're religious and spiritual, it means that you have self-identified probably also with one of those things in the first question box, right? So you are a Christian, you are a Muslim, you are a Buddhist, you are a Hindu, you describe yourself as belonging to a religious tradition, maybe not even belonging, having maybe even some cult, like in our interviewees, some people had a cultural affinity, had grown up Catholic, were happy to tick a box to say they were Catholic, but then when you talk to them, they're like, yeah, but I'm not really religious, like I'm not really Catholic. But I am kind of Catholic. So then you're religious, and the spiritual part seems to be one of 2 things, broadly speaking. One is that you kind of identify more with that sense of a sort of higher power, a higher universe. You're doing things kind of on your own, maybe, or in spiritual groups rather than in religious groups. And so, yeah, it's the practices as well that tend to define people as having a spiritual orientation, like in terms of yoga, meditation. Now, some of those things can also be practiced religiously, right? So I think, Nancy Emmerman's study is fantastic in that way, that it just sort of really says, hang on a minute, they're not really that distinctly different. They're not, spirituality is also practiced in groups. You can believe in God and be spiritual, all of those things. Now, they're spiritual but not religious, and I realize we're running out of time, are people who really do not want anything to do with any religious organization and do not identify at all with any religious group, but they are still doing these other spiritual things. They still might even believe in God, but they're not religious. They still have that sense of a higher power, whether they call it God or not. And then they're doing these spiritual things, which could still be prayer, but just not as part of a religious group. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. For those who feel like we haven't had a chance to answer your questions, who want to keep the conversation going, get in touch with us and we can try to pass those questions on where appropriate. Thank you so much, Anna, for your presentation today. And to the audience for joining. Please subscribe to our newsletter to stay informed about this and other upcoming events in the series hosted by the Contemplative Studies Center. And we look forward to chatting again with Anna and to seeing the rest of you in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much.